Hello and welcome to this video on the functionalist perspective of society. Functionalism is a sociological perspective. In many ways it is the foundation sociological perspective against which other perspectives are measured, or sometimes we have a kind of debate between the different perspectives. We often sort of kick off, if you will, with functionalism. Now, there had been functionalists prior to Emile Durkheim, namely Auguste Comte and Herbert Spencer, but it's Durkheim, a French sociologist, who really codifies it and turns it into a framework through which we can understand and study society. It's further developed then by a chap called Talcott Parsons, an American sociologist, who turns it into the dominant school of sociological thought by the 1950s and 60s. Functionalism is a macro approach, that is to say it looks at the whole of society and is interested in how society shapes the individual. It's also a structural theory because it's interested in the structure of society and the different elements and institutions within it. It looks at the needs of the whole social system and is interested in how our society actually has needs and how those needs are met. It looks at how these needs then go on to shape the system and how we actually see different societies or different types of societies in different parts of the world, and arguably it's because those different societies have different needs. Functionalism is a consensus theory, that is to say that it is broadly of the belief that we as individuals agree on things, we agree on norms and values, and that consensus is what allows for social order. It's also modernist in nature. It's very much a 20th century sociological perspective, and it believes that we can obtain true knowledge, that we can study the world, we can study the society, we can do experiments and do pieces of research, and when we gather data and we look at our findings, we can use those to improve society. And so, in a sense, it's a fairly positive view. So functionalists like to use what is known as the organic analogy to help us understand how society works. It's a nice sort of simple metaphor to understanding the similarity between the human body and society. And it's Parsons who does a fair bit of work on this, and he identifies three similarities between the human body and society. So firstly, in terms of the system, society has institutions and units. So our society has a government, has an education system, has the media, has religion, has the family, for example. And the body has similarly organs and cells. So we can think about the brain and the lungs and the heart and the kidneys and so on. These all perform certain tasks and activities very similar to the different institutions in our societies, which are important in different ways. The system has needs. So our organs have needs. They need to be fed, they need nutrients, they need water, they need to be hydrated, they need to be stimulated, they need to be exercised. And so too do our institutions or individuals in society. They need certain bits and pieces, whether that be money, taxpayers' money, whether that be a constant supply of new fresh talent to go work, whether that be newly socialized children ready to be educated, so on. Finally, the organs have to work together, perform different functions together in order to survive and for the body to survive overall. Because if our brain's not talking to our heart, that's going to cause problems. And actually, this is similar to our society. We need to make sure that the government is talking to, the police force, is talking to the education system and the NHS and the family and religion and so on, if society is to flourish. Parsons often considered two big questions. How is social order possible? How are individuals able to cooperate? Because, human beings, we've quite liked living together, living in societies for a long period of time. We're fairly social beings. And the question is, how do we do it? How do we continue to get along? How do we cooperate? What causes or what allows this social order to flourish? And Parsons believed that it was because we have a shared culture, that we have a shared value system in society. So if we focus on the UK, the idea that we in the UK have a British culture within which there will be norms and values, and that's what enables us to have social order and enables us to cooperate. So culture provides us with these norms, values and rules. So norms, what is normal, what is acceptable. Values, what is important, what is desirable. Rules, what we can do, what we can't do. And that's a framework through which we can interact. And if we've all been socialized into it, that makes it much easier for us to kind of look to each other and work with each other and understand each other. Social order is therefore possible provided everyone agrees that we have that value consensus, we have a norm consensus, that we have a consensus about the rules in our society. And if we do that, that means we can understand each other, we can cooperate, we can have social order. In terms of how we go about integrating individuals into that shared social order then, that shared value consensus, well, this is the question. And the basic value or function, of value consensus is to make social order possible, Parsons argued. This integrates people into the social system, helping to meet the system's needs. And there's two different ways we can go about ensuring that conformity, and you may want to pause the video now and consider for a moment what those might be. Firstly, we have socialization. This is the big one. We talk about it quite a lot in A-level sociology, and this is the idea that you are socialized. When you are born, functionalists believe that you are tabula rasa, that you are a blank slate, and your parents socialize you into society's norms and values. To be fair, education and the media and religion and other agencies of socialization play a role too, but your parents are a big influence here. Secondly, social control. In our society, we do have different agents of social control. Some are quite in your face, some are a little bit more kind of under the table, if you will. Namely, we can think of the police. They are very visible. We know that they have powers to do certain things, whereas perhaps the media tends to be a little bit more insidious, and it kind of teaches us norms and values without us realizing. Social control is done by imposing different types of sanctions, both positive and negative. So if you work hard, whether that be in education or in the world of work, you will be rewarded either with top grades or with maybe a bonus or maybe a promotion. Whereas if you don't work hard, if you break the rules or the laws or the norms, there's going to be negative sanctions. Everything from being told off by a parent to a detention in school, or perhaps even something more serious once we become an adult and move into the world of work. Once an individual is integrated, our behavior is orientated towards society's goals and needs. So in a sense, we're kind of trained, we are socialized into thinking, how can we meet society's needs? And we will gain experiences and qualifications, and we will learn our place in the world with a view to meeting society's needs. In a sense, this therefore makes our behavior fairly predictable and stable, and it allows people to cooperate because we're all more or less trying to do the same things. We're trying to earn money, trying to survive, pay the taxes, look after the kids, get an education, enjoy ourselves, and so on. Therefore, integration into the shared normative order is what makes social order possible. Because we've all been socialized, because we were all aware of the different forms of social control out there, we are able to get along for the most part, more or less. And so from simple ideas, Parsons has built a fairly complex model of society, which is pretty useful when we're trying to understand how society operates. In terms of the social system and its sort of different constituent parts, Parsons uses a model which has sort of 4 different elements to it, and we're going to start at the bottom here and move up. And as we move up, sort of the building block gets larger, if you will. So the smallest building block is individual actions. You as an individual, you engage in certain actions, and those actions aren't random, they are governed by rules and norms. You have been socialized into behaving a certain way, and by doing that, that kind of, will control to an extent how you're going to behave, or at least it's going to make your behavior predictable. Next, as a result of behaving in a certain way, but perhaps you've been trained to do a certain thing, you then gain a status role, and that status role is made up of all the actions that you do in a certain way. So for example, a certain set of actions are given a status of teacher. So if you were to go to train to be a teacher, you would learn the different actions, different individual actions you need to engage in order to be a teacher. When we then lump together a whole group of individuals engaging in certain status roles, we then have a subsystem. So a cluster of status roles is, for example, a school. So if we were to look at a place where lots of teachers were engaging in certain individual actions that they've been trained to do, we'd see that as a school or a college or a university. Finally then, that school is part of a subsystem of other schools, which is arguably makes up the education system as a whole, and that is part of the larger social system. So that is one of, if you will, the organs in our organic analogy of the human body to the society we live in. Parsons said society is a system with needs, And Parsons identifies 4 main needs known as the Agile schema. Sometimes it's simply referred to as the Agile schema because it seems a little bit easier to say. And each need is met by a different subsystem. So, firstly, adaptation meets material needs through the economic subsystem. So, we as a society, we as individuals, we have economic needs, we have material needs, we have things we need to survive, everything from food, clothing, housing, and so on. And so we need a subsystem which is actively going out of its way, or we are part of and actively going out of our way to meet those needs. The second need is goal attainment, and this allocates goals through a political subsystem. So we need a government, we need different political parties who are going to be putting forward different ideas, different ideologies, if you will, and through a process of debate and argument and discussion, we are going to allocate, or the government's going to allocate sort of the goals, if you will, for our society, the things that we're looking to achieve. And it also, in a sense, allocate sort of more minor goals to different parts of society and what different, say, economic subsystems are going to seek to do to meet the needs of society. Next, integration. So there's another need. We need to knit people together via a cultural and community subsystem. So we need a way in which we are going to be teaching norms and values, and that's obviously primarily the family, but it's also the education system and the media. We need other sort of institutions in our society that bring people together, and in a sense things like religion, but also it could be things like sports and leisure facilities. These all help bring people together. And the final need is latency. We need to maintain patterns and ease tensions, and the best way we can do this is through the family or kinship, i.e. extended family system. So, we need a way of maintaining some sort of structure on kind of an individual personal level by having families, people we can rely on, people who are going to teach us and nurture us and support us. And, the family and the kinship system is the best way to do that. Also, at times we are going to be upset. We are going to be anxious, nervous, sad, angry. And we need, or let's say society needs a way of easing those tensions. And arguably the family is the best place to do that. Parsons then goes on to identify 2 types of society. And we're thinking about how different societies have different needs, and that kind of helps us to understand why you might have different types of society. And the 2 types he identifies are the traditional and the modern. Each type has its own typical pattern of norms, and Parsons identifies 5 basic sets of norms for each society. Within each type, the variables fit together. So you're going to see a correlation between the 5 different norms in that basic set of norms within each society. So, in terms of looking at the differences between the norms in traditional and modern societies, you will see that in the table there are some empty cells. This is because you should already know what these norms are based on your learning in the first year. And so I would advise that you pause now and maybe jot down what you think the answers are, and then you'll be able to see whether you got it correct in a moment. So then, in traditional societies, generally the norm is that people have ascribed statuses. This is to say the status you are born with. You are given a status at birth, whether that be a child in a household that defers to mother and father, or more often in a sort of more wider sense, your social class. Are you working class, middle class, or if you're in a traditional society, maybe remnants of an aristocracy or upper class, and you would have a status that you have been born with. Next, diffuseness. Relationships are broad with a range of purposes. So because often people lived in large families and actually worked together in an agricultural setting on a farm, relatives were also workmates. Next, particularism. Norms emphasize treating different people differently. So, again, going back to that idea of ascribed status, you would know your place in society and you would treat others based on their status. But also, it may mean that you treat people in, say, your family differently from the way that you might treat other people in society. Next, immediate gratification, desiring to have the joy or the pleasure now rather than putting it off maybe for greater joy or pleasure later on. And finally, collectivism, putting the group before the self, putting the needs of a collective before your individual needs and wants. In comparison, in modern societies, today it's all about achieved statuses. So you gain a status through your own hard work and efforts and abilities rather than being given a status at birth. Next, specificity. Relationships are narrow and limited to specific purposes. So you have specific relationships with different individuals, and often that will be the only sort of dimension to your relationship. So a lawyer will have a client, and that's the only way that they interact. A a teacher and a student will interact in lessons, and that's it. Next, universalism. Norms emphasize everyone being treated the same. So again, if you think about this idea of awarding a job, you would do it to the most qualified person if you were an employer, rather than perhaps giving it to your son and daughter because you're related to them. That would be problematic. That would be considered nepotism. Next, deferred gratification. So the ability to put off joy and pleasure for greater joy and pleasure later on. So, the idea, if you do a qualification, you don't get the qualification on day one. You have to put in a lot of energy and effort over the space of a year or two, thinking about A-levels, before you actually get the qualification. Finally, individualism, this idea of me, me, me. Today, in our modern or indeed postmodern society, it's all about you. It's all about putting yourself first and thinking about your needs and your desires and your wants. So the next question for Parsons is, how does social change occur? And how do societies change from one to another? Well, he would argue that this process is a gradual evolutionary one by which structures become more complex. Our societies become more complex, and the different institutions within it, they have changed and they have become more complex. And this is similar to how as single-cell organisms mutated and evolved into animals, so too simple structures such as the traditional extended kinship system became what we now see as a modern complex society. These kinship systems may then lose functions to other institutions, and this is known as structural differentiation. And again, this is something we looked at in the first year. So we saw how the family used to be, or the extended kinship system used to be responsible for looking after those who were unwell or ill. It also used to be responsible for looking after the elderly. It also used to be responsible for making clothes and making food. It also used to be responsible for educating the young. And slowly but surely, every single one of those functions has been lost and given away to the NHS, to the education system, to different businesses and companies within our economy, for example. And this is known as structural differentiation. Ultimately, however, that equilibrium that existed in the traditional society is reinstated. It comes back despite that change, which could upset that equilibrium. It comes back, and in the modern society, we have that equilibrium, that harmony once again. Now then, in terms of the internal and external critiques of the functions perspective of society, we are going to cover that in the lesson. That will be part of our lessons together, but you will want to brainstorm some potential evaluative points in preparation for the lesson, and you may find that there are some hints in the reading that you have been provided also. So to conclude with a short overview of everything we've looked at today, functionalism seeks to answer the question of how social order is possible. How is it that human society is harmonious? How is it that we cooperate? How is it that we more or less get along most of the time? How is it that human society has been so successful, if you will? It often ignores conflict and is often seen as being too deterministic. So we've got some criticisms here. Arguably, functionalism takes a rose-tinted view of society. It sees only the positive and ignores the negative, such as conflict. And it does kind of intimate that we as individuals are shaped and molded by society, and we go on to behave a certain way, that our lives are predetermined, if you will, which is possibly a little bit too deterministic. Many critics, including conflict theorists, however, borrow the notion that society is a system of interdependent parts. So part of the legacy of functionalism is that they're not the only group of sociologists to buy into that idea. And finally, Ian Crabb in 1992 said that Parsons' theory has its faults, but at least it is a theory of society as a whole. So it's a very useful theory. It's kind of a holistic theory. It looks at everything, and it's quite a neat theory for summing up in a fairly simplistic way how we perhaps can think of or understand society. That's it. Thank you very much. Any issues, problems or queries, please make sure you take those up with your sociology teacher. Send them an email or catch them between lessons or perhaps after lessons, and I'm sure they'll be more than happy to answer your questions. Thank you very much.